I would say like this is a tough time for fantasy managers, Tyler. Like this has been a trying season, just in general. A lot of injuries, a lot of
Hmm.
changes on the depth chart, and
Yeah.
strategy is like more. You gotta be if you ever say luck is the biggest factor in fantasy football, this year will prove you wrong.
Yeah.
This year, you can talk about luck with injuries, but it's more about like your midseason strategy and how you can navigate through it. Let's break down a couple of different spots here, right? Like there's obviously teams who are 8-0. There's teams who are 0-8. Probably not very many of either of those, if we're being honest with the way
Yeah.
this season's played out. I'm gonna be honest with you. This week sucked because I had so many teams. It was weird because I had so many teams after the first set of early morning games. They were destroying my opponent. And then I had a bunch where it was like comeback central. And then same thing on Monday night. Some leads that I thought were safe. We had a lot of like players that we normally don't see have high games have
Well,
really high
Tyron
scoring
Tracy,
outputs.
I know for sure won some people their game on
I
Monday
mean,
night.
he was what a 20 over 20 point
20,
player
yeah,
yesterday.
it was nearly 30 points. He had a monster week. So,
And
yeah, if I'm
it's
if
for losing teams,
losing
man.
teams,
For
so
losing teams. Let's start there because teams that are two and
yeah,
six or maybe 0-8, 1-7, like there's the want to give up. That's like the
yeah,
first thing top of mind. You want to give up, but that's
yeah,
not what we're gonna recommend.
no. A lot of my teams, I'm basically around 500. There's a couple leagues that I'm doing better than 500, but they're like I talked about. I want to say last week or the week prior. My main league, I'm currently 3-5, and I was 2-5 this week. Thankfully, I won, and I'm in a spot, and I kind of. And this is how I'm approaching going forward. Now, my team's been a bit unlucky. Like I have Tyreek Hill, might as well have been hurt for the past 8 weeks of the season. My God, he's been borderline unplayable. I have Nico Collins on this team. He's been hurt. Travis Kelsey's been so I've have a lot of players. I have Jalen Hurts, who's now, been fantastic, but there's a lot, like, I think this team is good. And what I would do with this team going forward is if you're especially if you're in a spot where you only have 2 wins or something, like you got to absolutely swing for the fences. And what I mean by that is you just got to take like the absolute I would even recommend this for any team, but especially for these kind of teams where you're like a guy, I recommend trading for a guy like Michael Pittman. And it may make no sense for a lot of people out there, but where I think it makes sense is I do think there's a real chance a guy like Anthony Richardson gets sat down. And I think it's a lot sooner than later. And Michael Pittman offers that where last year we saw him. He was a top 13 wide receiver last year. So he's a guy that it's going to be really hard to acquire studs if you're a bad team because you're not really going to have players to trade away, most likely, unless you're just super unlikely or unlucky. So what you have to do is you got to look for these advantageous situations where you could potentially land studs at a severe discounted price. Another guy I'd be trying to trade for right now, Travis Etienne. Everybody loves Tank Bigsby. He's looked fantastic. Don't get me wrong, but what happens if Tank Bigsby goes down with an injury? Like, obviously, Travis Etienne is the next man up. And what happens if Travis Etienne comes back? I still think he's going to be involved. I don't think Travis Etienne has been benched. I think it's going to be a split backfield. What happens if now you have all these wide receivers go down? Travis Etienne sees a ton of receiving work going forward because he's a pretty good receiving back. Like, I think that these are kind of players that I would be trading for because the odds are severely stacked against you, where you need to acquire players at a severe discount that can flip the script for you and have a good second half of the season. And the last part are rookies. If I can acquire rookies become second half of the league winners, second half of the season winners. Guy like Xavier Worthy, a guy like I don't even know who else off the top of my head, but rookies in general are guys that we see second half of the season break out and have big weeks. So guys like that, I just be swinging for the fences on.
I'm there with you, right? Like swing for the fences. But one thing I also keep in mind is like if you're 0-8, you're 2-6, you really don't have time for like
To wait
development.
around.
You don't have time
Yeah.
for like to figure it out. So you do got to swing for the fences, but I tend to do it with players who have already had their bye. So I look for teams that like if a perfect player to do that with before this week would have been like a Calvin Ridley. The same thing we're talking about with Michael Pittman. It's just like supreme upside to like maybe have a bounce back effort in the second half. Another guy, Quentin Johnston, like somebody that had a decent game now, but has already had their bye, had a good workload. Obviously, you're not getting Lab McConkey for cheap after last week, but like
No.
Quentin Johnston might go under the radar. You talk about guys like DJ Moore, just players who, Jalen Waddle, players who maybe
Yeah.
haven't lived up to expectation, but have already had their bye and still have potential to at least help you win. Because the one thing you can't have is a roster that has a lot of holes in it over the next few weeks with buys. So I think there's 2 weeks left where we have 6 teams with bye on week 12 and week 14.
Yeah.
Those got to be 2 wins for you. Like, you can't have players from
Yeah.
week 14 and
Bye.
16 if you're 0-8 or 2-6. Like, you have to have those weeks covered. So I think going back and looking at the teams who have already had their bye weeks, trading for those players, especially the ones with like a little bit less value right now, or maybe even picking up some options, it's not the greatest names, but like a Juju Smith or Jawan Jennings or like players like that can help you out afterward. If you're going to have somebody on your bench, have somebody in the starting role that's already had their bye. So
Another guy I would trade for too, I think kind of is a little bit underappreciated, like Amari Cooper. I really think Amari Cooper is going to tear it up second half of the year. And I think a lot of people are looking at
perfect
like
time to
Keon
get him.
Coleman and Khalil Shakir. They're like, oh, these guys, this team did not trade for Amari Cooper to have him not be a factor. Like, he's going to be a factor, and we know how good he is. So he's another guy that I would trade for. That next week could be like, we should have seen it coming. Amari Cooper, I agree. It is kind of tough, but it's tough. You can't wait, but it's also hard because I'm trying to sit here like Puka Nakua, Cooper Kupp would have been great trade targets like a couple weeks ago. And maybe Nico Collins. I don't think anybody's going to give up Nico Collins though. And there's really nobody else that's just kind of sitting on like
Well,
that.
if you're there shouldn't be a whole lot of 0-8 teams. Just with the way this year's played out, like maybe there's a couple out there. And if you're watching, sorry, I know it's been a shitty year for you. But like, I think for most teams, you have a player on your team. If you're 2-6 or 1-7, you have a player that somebody else covets. And I think right now, if you can't make if you don't have the pride enough to be like, look, I have this high performing player, I want to ship them out for maximum value. This is the time to do it. Like, you don't wait another week if you're 0-8 or you're 1-7 and now you have 8 losses is pretty much you're not making the fantasy playoffs. And that's really the goal right now. It's just to get in the playoffs if you have like a losing record. So
Jalen Waddle's a good call out. That's a really good kind of target. That
that's what I do.
Could blow up.
I try to, what I'm saying? I try to have some good information for the people watching. You feel me?
Guys like that,
It's like you want to find the higher upside guys. And I want to say DJ Moore had a really bad game too, but it's
he's definitely a guy I would try to get. Yeah.
So now you get a stretch of four or 5 games where they play well. This helps your chances of getting in. So I think it's time to swing for the fences, especially if you have like, maybe you have a player that was, Alvin Kamara, somebody that you drafted and you got a really good value on, even like a Joe Mixon, just somebody that's a good trade asset right now, a good name value. Even if they're going to be top 5 at their position later, you have a CD Lamb on your team. This is the perfect time to trade those guys and get like 3 to 4 players that can make sure you have a full roster moving forward. Like, that's the one thing I'll say for anybody that's a losing roster. Trade with the guy that's 6-1 in your league. Maybe you give him a better chance to win, but you give yourself a chance now to make the fantasy playoffs. I would recommend doing that.